So I think we move on with the track session, and everyone knows John, so I'll hand you over for this morning's track session. Over to you, John Forte.
Good morning. That's the spirit. And my point is, there's a lot of focus on how to automate. There have been a lot of discussions on frameworks, on tools. I'm going to focus on this session on the prerequisites, the things you need to think of getting in place before going into automation, all right? So when we looking at my title is Get Ready, Set, Automate, I'm going to focus on the Get Ready and Set. Now, in the next 45 minutes or so, I intend to discuss about what are the benefits you can expect from automation, looking at what is the big picture, return on investment. Obviously, this is the theme of the conference. So I've inserted a slide actually taken from our conversation yesterday. How can you, for example, put some value money on the return on investment you're getting out of automation? Then addressing some of the people issues you might face, and last but not least, a framework for assessing your readiness for automation. All right? All right, I'm going to start with showing this image. This is taken actually from 1897, so it's over 100 years old. And what's interesting is that you see actually an automation device that has implemented to automate the dinner around the table. Now, what's interesting here is the fact that there's no computer presence. Interestingly, you see some of the limitation in that automation device present in the automation solution we see today. So, for example, you have a device here for automating the pouring of the wine, yeah? So you might ask yourself, I've created this device and you're pulling this lever, but you can equally just use your hand using the same movement. So you're creating a lot of additional effort to create a movement that resembles what you can achieve manually. Now, this is a trap that we often fall into also when doing real-life automation on software. I'll get back to this. Another thing is you look at the maintainability of this, yeah? Now, let's assume that the people want to switch around in the room. So, you have the child moving from this table to another table. Obviously, this solution will not be able to accommodate that because, as you can see, because the boy is short, he has a different device set up for him that will not accommodate the change in shifting the people around the table. All right? I'll get back to this later on when we discuss automation, discuss similar issues you'll be facing when creating automated solutions. All right. So let's take a step back. Why do we need automation? Just out of curiosity, how many of you are involved in automation, doing automation today? Raise your hands. How many of you can use your hand and awake? All right, not all. All right. Okay, thank you. So it looks like about 20-30% of the audience here have actually tried some level of automation. What we see is, of course, the technology shift that we have seen and discussed in the last couple of days, for example, going digital, the fact that we are now creating systems that are interconnected, where you're moving away from the old siloed monolithic systems and starting, putting them together, hooking them together. Now, this is causing a lot of, improvement or efficiencies on the development side, yeah? Because, you can reuse a lot of aspects. A lot of components can be reused between the systems. Now, from a testing point of view, this is creating a big challenge because sometimes you run into the issue of, you make a small change in one small tiny system and then you have the domino effect, things starting falling apart, and this is where you start focusing a lot on regression testing, for example. Now, if you think about it, going mobile, for example, we have, people accessing your internet, banking, your Netflix, whatever devices you have or apps you have on your mobile. What is happening is shifting the focus away from the internal releases that are within your control, something external that is beyond your control. So let me ask you, who is controlling your releases? Is it your own company? You're nodding. What if, let's say a couple of months from now, Apple is going to release a new operating system or a new device is coming out, the new version of Samsung Galaxy 8, whatever, the new version of. Do you think your company will need to send a new release out because of that? What if you have like monolithic, we're talking about legacy systems like SAP, Oracle, whatever. Oracle is now releasing the new patch, the new service pack. Do you think you need to do additional testing because of that service pack? Now the point is, the main change is that your release schedule is now being controlled not by you, but by external factors. So what used to be under your 100% control is now shifting gradually to external parties that are outside of your control. See a lot of, in the banking area, for example, you probably have heard about blockchain. Yeah? Blockchain technology coming in, providing a platform for transactions. Now, obviously, at some point in time, if you're working in a bank or if you're working with any kind of financial institute that can leverage transactions, a transaction platform, you'll be affected by that technology. Again, something that is beyond your control. Interesting when we see, for example, in the medical area, medical devices area, life sciences area, we see a lot of increase in the regulations and compliance requirements, making sure that whenever you make changes, you can document, you can test, and you can document that you've done the testing that is needed to support that particular change that has been implemented. Customer awareness, another effect we discussed that yesterday. I mean, I think there was an example given that in the old days you had these old versions of the WordPerfect 20 years back, it was crashing every 5 minutes or so, and you had this, I remember the saying that please remember to save before printing, because each time you hit the print button, there's a big chance that the application will fall apart and crash. This is no longer being accepted by the users. Nowadays, especially we're talking about, for example, apps. Using this app, if it doesn't work, you just shift to another app, you replace it. Rapid development cycles. We've heard a couple of speakers discussing DevOps, continuous integration, continuous delivery, and so forth. And the idea behind it, of course, is shorten the development cycles. Now, analogy behind that is if you think, for example, that I want to move, for example, some water from this location to another. One way of doing it is having a number of people then passing some buckets with some water, yeah? But a more efficient way would be creating a pipeline, yeah? And just having continued flow of water going from this location to the other. Now, what we're trying to achieve by these concepts, continuous delivery, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous quality, is having this continuous feed of software into production, being deployed, being tested constantly. And we're talking about cycles going down as, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week. We're talking about continuous, actually on hourly basis, software, small minor bits and pieces being released into production. All this calls for a level of automation that we haven't seen before. Same time, financial pressure. We're discussing this during the panel session yesterday also. We have some companies, service providers like myself, where we know that we need to improve, for example, certain crunches. Year on year, we need to improve 15%, 20% of efficiency, provide this back to the customer. We need to do it cheaper for the customer. You need internally to provide your service. It's cheaper to your employer. So all in all, this is probably what your table looks like. You're a tester, your task is piling up, and this is where you think it would be nice with automation kicking in, helping me to take some of the burden off my shoulders. All right? All right. So let me ask you, why do you want to automate? What are the main things that you can achieve by it? Sorry? Automate the process. Other views? Consistency. Other reasons for automation? Reduce manpower. All right. Repetitive work. All right. You've mentioned some of these things. Obviously, reproducibility is one key element, yeah? You know how it is. First time you get, for example, a new version of the software, you're very excited, I want to test it, I want to find all the bugs. I'm going to show the developers that it's full of flaws, yeah? You start working out, finding all the defects, reporting them back, and discussing with your fellow developers and so forth. Well, second time you get the software, you may be less enthusiastic. By the fourth or fifth time, you're not maybe even concerned anymore. You might, slip some bugs. You might, miss a few defects and so forth. So obviously, we want to use test automation to be able to help us reproduce, repeat the process and reproduce bugs. For example, if you find them, we want to be able to, for example, recreate the conditions that have created that particular bug. Coverage. For example, you have one test that you want to run across multiple configurations, similar configurations, different configurations. You might have, for example, a system running on multiple browsers. You want to cover all these browsers. Now, if you're into the area of mobile devices, you might have a gigantic number of configurations, permutations, combinations that you need to cover. Leverage. Some tests are difficult to perform manually. For example, you want to test some back-end activities. You want to, for example, test that certain fields, certain records in a database have a certain value. You want to go back and, for example, behind the scenes and see that certain files have been created. You want to access the back-end system, for example, and see some transactions, some FTP transactions have happened. These can be very difficult to perform manually or require certain tools. This is obviously one area where automation tool can come to the aid. Feedback, we were discussing this before. One of the key points you want to achieve using automation is getting this continuous feedback. This is one of the key elements in the whole agile methodologies, where you're shortening the development cycles and having this continuous feedback on the state and quality of your systems. Again, back to the analogy of creating the pipeline. Equally, you want to create a pipeline of tests, making sure that whenever things break, you don't need to wait 3 weeks before you can get, to find out that things have broken. You want to figure that immediately, as soon as possible. Last but not least, speed. Want to use, I think, had a couple of comments on reducing manpower. We want to optimize the testing process. We want to make sure that we can run the test as often as needed and as fast as possible. And indeed, tools make it possible for us to decrease the time for execution. Typically, tools can run, for example, if you're talking about high-end tests, you're going through the GUI, it can run it in like 10 to 15% of the time it takes to run it manually. All right. Now, the typical focus of automation is often regression testing. Now, I'm sure you probably are doing regression testing, and I'll put in the definition taken from the ICP glossary here. Basically, the regression is about making sure that things that used to work are still working. So it's not testing the new features, but testing actually all the other things that are still there intact after making a certain change. One of the statements by Einstein was that insanity is doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results. Yeah. Now, for me, This is a bit like doing regression testing. Yeah, you're doing the same things over and over again, and hoping actually not to find different result. So perhaps maybe the main value you're getting out of automating regression testing is preventing you going insane, maybe in the long run. All right. Now, let me just, again, I think 30% of you were saying you were doing some kind of automation. How many of you are doing unit testing at your companies? Raise of hands. All right. How many are automating at the API level? UI level? Database level? Oh, okay. There are a few guys who are really automating a lot of stuff. The typical starting point in many organizations is looking at the GUI, the UI. Meaning looking at the typical screens that you have and trying to do mimicking the behavior of a normal user, trying to go through normal interfaces and repeat a certain transaction, enter some entries into a field, for example, and simply put it into the system and see the response that you get. Which can give you, of course, a lot of benefits. You're actually repeating the stuff and providing you as close as possible to real users. However, and those who have tried and I'll get back to this, you probably experienced that when you automate at the GUI level, this is also where your automation scripts become very vulnerable to any kind of changes that happens on the GUI. Now, if you look at the big picture, most of the stuff happens actually on the server side and the middleware, on the database, on the back end. Now, if you're only automating at the GUI level, then you're missing out on multiple aspects. So one thing is, of course, one thought I want to leave behind is please try to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.